Welcome to the I-29 Moo U Dairy Podcast. The I-29 Moo University is a consortium of the land-grant universities located in Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska. This podcast covers timely news, information, and research for today's dairy industry.
Hi, my name is Jim Salfer, University of Minnesota Regional Educator, and today I'm representing the I-29 Moo University, which is a consortium really of Iowa State, University of Minnesota, South Dakota State, and Nebraska. And it's really my pleasure to have Dr. Sandra Godden, who I consider a colleague of mine. Sandra is in the vet school at the University of Minnesota, and she might be a familiar name for many listeners because she really has done a lot of research over the last, I think it's safe to say, decades on really, maybe we don't want to talk about that, Sandra, that we've been here a long time, but really a lot of research on colostrum and colostrum absorption, colostrum pasteurization. And so that's really our topic for today. I also have a colleague with me, Fred Hall, who's with Iowa State University. Welcome, Fred. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Jim. Nice to be here.
Pleasure to be working with such distinguished colleagues.
So, Sandra, do you just want to give a little overview? I mean, we all know that colostrum is important, but it's always a really good reminder about why it's really important that we get colostrum into calves early.
At the very high level, it's one of the cornerstones of our young stock rearing program. We know we need to get adequate, if not excellent would be preferred, transfer of passive immunity, those colostral antibodies absorbed shortly after birth. And we've learned a whole lot more about the importance of colostrum just beyond those antibodies, the nutritional support, the growth and immune system development. There's a whole lot of other bioactive compounds and such in colostrum that promote not just health, but growth, development, and long-term future production potential for the cow. So it's not just the antibodies, it's the whole ball of wax that matters.
Do you know what some of those are, Sandra? Can you mention some of them?
Oh, Jim. Well, we'll start with the nutrients. We've got easily double the fat, easily triple, if not quadruple, the protein in colostrum that we would have in normal, saleable tank milk. There's obviously the high levels, high concentrations of antibodies that are in very low levels in saleable milk. And then if we look to vitamins and minerals, vitamins in particular, we've got higher concentrations of vitamin A and some other things in there to promote the health and growth of the calf. In terms of bioactive compounds, I'm just thinking of things like growth factor, hormones, things like that are going to promote gut development. With even a few days of feeding of the colostrum in the transition milk, we see improved gut development and associated improved rate of gain. So that's going to go a long way to helping the calf as well. So it's beyond just the impact of those antibodies.
So as we look at what's in the colostrum, we know there's seasonal differences. Can you kind of point out what that might be?
Sure, Fred. Yeah, we've got two concerns with season. One is related to quality or the concentration of antibodies in the colostrum. And the other has to do with yield, how much she produces at that first milking. Let's talk about quality first. If we do not provide adequate heat abatement to our dry cows, and by that I mean shade, water, soakers, sprinklers, fans, the works, not only do we impair the dry cow, her future lactation performance potential, but we can negatively impact the quality of the colostrum that she produces if she's going through her dry period during the worst part of the summer. I'm sitting in Minnesota, of course, saying that. So our summer, we get a lot of heat stress, a lot of heat and humidity. And so, yeah, if she's going through her dry period at that time and doesn't get good heat abatement, we can see impaired quality. We can also see, and this is a little counterintuitive, impaired yield, but this is actually the opposite of the summertime problem. Some herds, not all, will experience periods where they go through where yields are not what they should be. Normally, we'll get 4 to 6 quarts of colostrum from adult, like mature cows, not first lactation heifers. But many herds will go through a period as we head into the late fall and early winter months where yield drops with the onset of cold weather. And we don't for sure know why that happens. Is it shortened photoperiod? Is it colder weather? Is it a combination of the two? Is that interacting with available metabolizable protein and energy that she's getting through her diet during the dry period? There's probably a multitude of factors interacting there, but many herds, like I said, go through waning, lower yields produced as we head into the winter months. So that's something that herds need to think about and plan for.
You know, Sandra, one of the things that's changed over the last couple of years, and it's a couple of years old now, but there's kind of a change from kind of cut points to levels on maybe where our whether it's IgG levels, whether it's serum total protein levels. Do you want to comment a little bit about what those levels or kind of what the recommended levels are? Because they've kind of got an excellent, good, fair, and poor category, which maybe makes a little more sense than just these kind of cut points. It's either really good or really bad. And then why should we be concerned, or what are the advantages of going from good to excellent or fair to excellent? And what are the recommendations of a percentage of your colostrum or your serum protein levels at those, maybe some of those different those different levels?
Yeah, Jim, that's a really good question. And people who want to know the exact cut points recommended, different levels recommended, like I said, encourage you to go back to the webinar. You can look at the slide and take your time studying that slide. Historically, we have measured things like serum total protein as an indirect measure of the level of IgG, the immunoglobulin G in the calf's blood in that first week of life. And we've simply looked at it as a pass-fail. If we use a cut point of 5.1 to 5.2 grams per deciliter serum total protein as our pass-fail mark. Historically, we've wanted at least 90% passing and fewer than 10% failing. And we have known for many years now, decades, that if you fail, there's an increased risk of, in particular, mortality, but also in many studies, an increased risk of morbidity. Also impaired rate of gain, also impaired future production potential. More recently, and by more recently, I mean in the last 10 years or so, herds have gotten better and better, and they're not getting 90% at or above 5.1. They're getting maybe 50% or more at or above 6 or 6.5. And so the better managed herds have come back to us, the researchers, and asked the question, is more better? Is this a case where higher is better? And so a few years ago, well, back in 2014, they did the most recent NOM study where Dr. Jason Lombard, who at the time worked for USDA NOMS, he was running the study. They collected IgG, serum total protein, serum Brix readings from over 2,000 calves from over 100 herds around the country. And they asked the question, is higher better? And should we be using different cut points? Is there an added advantage to getting higher levels? And when they analyzed their data, that's exactly what they saw. Certainly, if you failed, if you were below 5.1, there was definitely an increased risk for morbidity and mortality in the pre-weaning period. But when they looked at the pass and then they categorized that into fair level, good level, excellent level, with an excellent being a serum IgG of 25 grams per liter or higher, they saw progressively improved, meaning reduced risk for morbidity and mortality. So higher definitely is better. Now, we don't expect herds to get 100% of their calves in the excellent range, 25 grams per liter or higher, but we did look at the top 30% of herds and asked, well, what's achievable? And so what we're currently recommending is that, again, fewer than 10% fail. That hasn't changed. Over 90% should pass. But of the ones that fall in that pass range, we want roughly 20% or less in the fair range, that's 10 to 18 grams per liter IgG, maybe 30% or more in the good, that's 18 to 25 grams per liter IgG, and at least, if not higher than 40% of calves tested in the excellent range, that being 25 grams per liter or higher. So yeah, we don't expect 100%, but we want 70% or more in that good and excellent zone. And if you are achieving that, you are doing very well.
In the webinar, one of the things we talked about was achieving a maximum colostral feeding in that first feeding. What about second feedings and extending these colostrum feedings? What's the current science?
Yeah, that's a good question, Fred. Weirdly enough, we don't have a lot of controlled trials looking at the value of the second feeding, but we've got plenty of empirical evidence from the field where herds have gone from one feeding to two feedings. They've monitored the response in terms of serum total proteins and health of the calves. We just finished a project this summer. In fact, we should have results available this winter looking at the value of that second feeding. But bottom line is, yeah, there's absolutely value to that second feeding. And then third and beyond, if you get into the transition milk on day 2 and day 3, there's plenty of value to that as well. I mentioned earlier, not just improved health, but improved development of the gut and associated improved growth as well. So even if you can get that transition milk fed for this, maybe into the second or third day, there's definitely value to that. And in addition to that, several researchers have done studies now that have looked at extended feeding for as long as 2 weeks or maybe even 3 weeks, supplementing either the whole milk or milk replacer with either a colostrum supplement daily for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or if you were feeding pasteurized whole milk, adding the transition milk pool into that waste milk pool or that whole milk pool and feeding that for that first 2 or 3 weeks. And there's consistent evidence that that extended feeding for 2 or 3 weeks, that supplementation results in reduced incidence and duration of scours, decreased severity of scours, improved rate of gain, and in one study, decreased respiratory disease and decreased antibiotic use. So if there's a practical way to incorporate feeding transition milk or for even a couple of days, but if you could add it to your whole milk pool and feed it for longer than that, there's lots of benefit to be captured there.
How much does that take, Sandra? That's a really good question. I know there's one veterinarian that was promoting just freezing your colostrum in ice cubes, and that had an ice cube to each feeding. Is there any science about how much is enough? And do you have any kind of practical tips maybe on, or even maybe a colostrum replacer? Maybe people say, I just don't have enough colostrum. How much? Because that's kind of expensive, a colostrum replacer. How much do you have any, if there's no research, would you speculate on how much is enough?
Yeah, you make a really good point, Jim. While we've measured biological benefits to adding colostrum supplements or replacers to your milk replacer, that is an expensive strategy. The studies that have been done so far that have added colostrum supplements or replacers, they've added somewhere between 10 grams of IgG up to as much as 30 grams of IgG per feeding for that first couple of weeks. And while it's biologically effective, like you say, it's a little bit pricey. Now, the ice cube approach, basically it's a question of math. Nobody's actually done an ice cube experiment, but if we do math, let's say we're taking a surplus colostrum that's moderate quality, 50 grams per liter, and we want to get 10 grams per feeding into either the milk replacer or the whole milk diet. You're looking at 200 milliliters, if I can do math, which is not
quite a bit.
Foregone conclusion. You're looking at 200 milliliters of even moderate quality colostrum added to whatever it is you're feeding per feeding. Yeah, a liter. Yeah.
So if it's less than that, it's probably not none. I mean, obviously there's nutrition in it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's all the things you talked about earlier. But as far as really getting where you might see some of the advantages you had talked about is maybe less likely to happen.
Maybe, but we don't know, frankly, Jim, because nobody's done that dose titration study that I'm aware of, where, they've added 5 grams or 10 grams or 15 grams or 20 grams. We know that 10 or 30 works. Nobody's tried to titrate that down to, well, let's look at 5, let's look at 3. So there may be value to lower levels of supplementation, but we just don't have the science yet to support that.
Jim kind of opened the gate to talk about colostrum replacers and supplements. What are some things producers should be looking for if they elect to go one of those routes?
That's a good question, Fred. There are a lot of different products out there in the market, and sometimes it gets confusing, trying to sort out one from another and what's a good one, what's maybe not a good one. The first thing I would look for is it USDA licensed? That is not to say that a non-USDA licensed product will be a poor quality product. It's simply that with the USDA licensed products, we've got the safety, the quality, the dose, all of that is guaranteed. You know, it's inspected, it's tested, it's assured. So I would go with one of those products first. And then my next order of preference, there are two basic types of products out there. One is, well, think of it like spray-dried colostrum, or it's whey milk-based IgG. It's coming from colostrum. Those products are going to tend to have the similar composition to maternal colostrum that mom would have made. And that's my preference, is to have a replacer that looks like the composition of mom. Let's not monkey with mom's formula. So I prefer the colostrum-based products. There are products out in the marketplace where the IG, the antibodies that are sourced, that are in that bag, are from plasma or serum rather than from colostrum. And for a couple of different reasons, it would not be my preference. Again, not to say those products are necessarily bad, but in more than a couple studies now, comparing head to head, the colostrum-derived products against a plasma-derived product, for some reason, the plasma-derived products do not tend to be absorbed as well as the colostrum-derived product. And I don't know if that's because it's missing some of those other bioactive compounds that may be facilitating, potentiating absorption. I really don't know why the difference, but they don't tend to be absorbed as well. So what that means is if you want to achieve a certain target serum IgG level in the calf, you're going to need to feed a higher dose of a plasma product as a general rule to get to the same place as compared to a colostrum-derived product.
Is there advantages, at least this was probably several decades ago, or that one advantage of feeding your own colostrum is that is likely to contain potential antibodies to whatever diseases you might have on your farm. Is that, and then when the big push with the Yonis came along, and the concern, I guess, about Yonis, there was really a lot of discussion about going to colostrum replacers. And, so now it seems like that's maybe waned a little bit, but is that a justifiable concern, say for whatever reason you're out of colostrum or something, or it's just so much more convenient to feed a colostrum replacer? We all know they're really expensive, but it's really convenient. It's clean, it's been pasteurized, it doesn't contain diseases. Is there any disadvantages from an immune standpoint of feeding a good, high quality colostrum replacer from a disease standpoint?
So there were actually a few different questions
Yeah.
buried.
Yeah, there were.
That's the tease apart. Last question first. Are there any disadvantages to feeding a high quality replacer as opposed to maternal colostrum? And the answer is no, provided that you feed a sufficiently high dose of that high quality replacement product. So if we're trying to get, like with maternal colostrum, we're trying to get a minimum 150 to 200 grams into a calf, but truthfully, the average calf, I want to get closer to 300 grams of IgG. If we feed maternal colostrum that's averaging 85 gram per liter, which is what herds are easily doing today, well-managed herds times 4 liters, we're over 300 grams going into the average calf. So to match that, you would have to feed 300 grams of IgG in a colostrum replacer, which is certainly doable, but pricey. So there's that. However, if let's say you did that, you matched on dose, truly matched on dose, then your first question, Jim, was, I think, alluding to, would there be any difference in the antigen-specific antibodies coming through in that product as compared to what the cows would have made on that farm? And that's a really interesting question. And I've seen a couple of studies. We did one, and I think there's at least one other Debbie Haynes did, looking at the antigen-specific antibody profile in calves fed replacer, colostrum-derived replacer versus maternal colostrum. And there's really not a lot of difference. And if you think about why that might be, it actually makes a lot of sense. So if you think about where are these replacement products coming from in North America? Well, they're coming from commercial dairy herds that are exposed to every enzootic disease under the sun that every other dairy herd is exposed to. They're exposed to probably very similar vaccine programs from herd to herd to herd. That's where the surplus colostrum is being collected, purchased by these companies. So it actually shouldn't be surprising that the antigen-specific antibody profile in these products, at least the colostrum-derived products, is fairly similar.
That makes sense. Another question, I get on a lot of farms that really feed sufficient amounts of colostrum, not a lot, but some. Once in a while this happens. You get on a farm and they still really seem to struggle with calf health. And it's not uncommon that we start culturing the colostrum going into the calf, and it's really high in bacteria. And I think you've actually done some research on that. So do you want to comment how the importance of cleanliness, how clean should it be? So if someone's listening and saying, I wonder if I should culture my colostrum, should they do that routinely like bulk tank? I know there's a lot of questions here. Should that be routinely like bulk tank cultures? And I believe you looked at the most common sources of some of that bacterial contamination on farms, I believe, a number of years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In days gone by, we talked about the 3 Qs, quality, quantity, quickness, and if we could check those boxes, we were good. And then in more recent years, again, probably the last at least 10, 12 years or more, we've come to realize that cleanliness, same as feeding clean milk, feeding clean colostrum is very important. So if you haven't, well, let me back up. If you do have scouring calves in the first, I would say 5 days, 5, 6, 7 days, it could be other sources of exposure, certainly maternity pen or dirty calf housing scenario, dirty bedding, what have you. But I would also want to rule out dirty colostrum. So as you mentioned, Jim, you can culture colostrum, look at what the bacteria counts are, and if they're polluted, if they're really, really high levels, then you want to look at where that could be coming from and see if you can clean it up. So the one concern is that feeding dirty bacteria-laden colostrum can cause sick calves, scours in particular. The other concern with feeding colostrum with high bacteria counts is we've learned that high bacteria levels in the colostrum will actually block or bind or interfere with absorption of those antibodies across the gut and into the circulation. So if we feed dirty colostrum, we actually see lower serum IgG, lower levels of transfer of passive immunity in those calves. So that's the other reason we want to feed clean colostrum. So yeah, you mentioned we recommend herds do, monthly bulk tank cultures to see, what's going on with the cows. You could easily do a monthly culture of colostrum. I don't think you need the whole bulk tank culture profile. You simply look at your total bacteria count, look at your total coliform count. And if those 2 things are high, you've got a problem and you need to go figure out where it's coming from and then fix the management.
Okay, Fred, do you have any questions? Or I've got a few more
Well,
here.
I'm going to kind of follow up on what we're talking about, because I'm sure somebody hears about these high levels of contamination and immediately say, well, I'll just run my colostrum through my farm pasteurizer. Good idea or bad idea?
It depends. If your pasteurizer is set at an appropriate temperature for colostrum, then that's a good idea. So we suggest for colostrum 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees centigrade for 60 minutes. And it's important to remember this is a lower temperature, longer time approach than we normally use for pasteurizing milk. And the reason we want to lower the temperature is because we want to protect those important antibodies. If we use too high a temperature, we will nuke easily a third of the antibodies. So low temperature, long times, 60 degrees centigrade for 60 minutes. And that is one approach to helping to clean up your colostrum. Now, if it's really, really filthy, even the pasteurizer can't deal with all of the bugs. So it's still important that you start with something reasonably clean, or you'll get a garbage in, garbage out scenario happening.
During the webinar, Jim asked a question about your opinion on colostrum management systems, and he used the example of perfect udder. Is that something you want to talk about here in the podcast?
The perfect udder bags or the perfect udder pasteurizer, or what specifically, Fred?
I believe it was the bags is what.
Okay.
Is there.
Yeah, if you're familiar with the perfect udder system, and there are one or two others out there similar to them, but this is the one that I've done research with, and I like to support people that do research. It's a single-use disposable bag, comes in a 2 liter, 3 liter, 4 liter volume. And so what that means is, well, even if you don't heat treat, but if you do heat treat the colostrum first, then you put it in the bag. Now it's essentially a closed system until you're ready to warm it, attach the feeding probe and feed it, or attach a nipple if you prefer, and feed it. So it's a great way of keeping the colostrum clean while it's being stored, whether that's in the refrigerator or the freezer. The other thing that's pretty cool about the design, I am not an engineer, but they worked hard to figure a material that's going to transfer the heat quickly, so you can rapidly cool or rapidly warm up the colostrum in the bag. And they've shaped the bag in such a way that it's flat, basically, as opposed to a big cube. And if anybody's tried to freeze, I did this stupidly once, froze a gallon of colostrum in a gallon jug, a big cube. It took hours to thaw that thing because it was the surface area to volume ratio was all whatever messed up. So by freezing colostrum in a flat bag like the perfect udder system, or even a Ziploc bag, as long as it's flat, you've got more surface area exposed to, and it's thinner, so you can chill it faster, and then later you can warm it more quickly. So I guess those are some advantages of that system.
Yes, Sandra, I'm not getting paid by anybody here, but the farms that have put in those systems really like them. I mean, they're not cheap systems. Goodness sakes alive, nothing is cheap right now. But I think just from a labor standpoint, especially if you're large enough to have employees do it, my general rule on thumb on farms is make it really, really easy for your employees, and it's much more likely to get done correctly. I mean, and we're all that way, right? If we all develop systems that are really easy, it's just we're more likely to do it the way we should do it. So again, I'm sure not touting these systems, but if you're large enough and you're struggling to manage your colostrum system to make it effective, I think it might behoove you to at least investigate those systems and see if they might be for you, and visit with farms that have them. That's much better than listening to me on a podcast or listening to Sandra on a podcast. Go talk to the farms and find out what they like about these different systems. There's a few out there, and maybe some of the drawbacks to some of those systems.
That's great advice, Jim. Yeah, just go trot down the road, visit your neighbors, see what their experience has been. That's great advice.
So as another comment, maybe two questions. I know you probably end up with a lot of veterinarians and farms giving you a call. What do you think is the most common mistake you see people make in their colostrum system? Just as a general, is there something you see, that it's a percentage of the time you go, well, this is a common thing that I kind of get calls about, or when I'm troubleshooting that?
Back to Fred's question of the bacteria counts, I don't think enough people are either aware of the importance of that or appreciate the importance of keeping the colostrum clean. And this is true of colostrum and whole milk as well. The calls I get, usually they're from veterinarians trying to get advice to support a producer who's struggling, is that the handling of the colostrum or the handling of the whole milk, waste milk or surplus milk, this disposable milk ready to feed to the calves, it's not being handled in an appropriate way, and it's allowing bacteria to multiply and grow exponentially after harvest or between harvest and when they eventually get around to feeding it. So they either need to feed it more quickly, and or if they're going to store it, they need to treat it seriously, chill it down, keep it chilled until they are ready to warm and feed it or pasteurize and feed it, what have you. That would be the biggest complaint, the most frequent complaint I get. It turns out it's just dirty colostrum or dirty milk.
Do you have any comments on one cow, one colostrum? Again, that was a lot of discussion with the Onis, or is it important that cow one's calf gets colostrum from cow one, or is it just as easy? Because again, that's sometimes a little bit hard to manage. You put it in the refrigerator, date it. How long can colostrum keep in the refrigerator? Is there, do you have some guidelines whether it's frozen or in the refrigerator? So if you're doing this rotation system through a refrigerator, is there a time where you'd say, write a date on it and say, keep it this many days, toss it, even if it's good colostrum?
Okay, so a couple of questions there. So cow to cow, one cow to one calf. If you're feeding heat-treated colostrum, I don't believe it's as important. Farms that are feeding heat-treated colostrum know that usually we're going to pool colostrum that's been, collected and refrigerated over the previous, let's say 12 to 24 hours. It's pooled before it's heat-treated. So it's definitely not a one cow to one calf scenario. Because we're heat treating, I think that removes the risk. But if you're feeding raw or fresh colostrum, not heat treated, we still want to go with the one cow to one calf rule. The reason being, if that one cow is unbeknownst to us shedding mycoplasma or salmonella, or you mentioned Yoni's in her colostrum is subclinical, then by using the one cow to one calf rule, only one calf is put at risk. Whereas if you pool colostrum from multiple cows, now you're putting multiple calves at risk. Now, is it critical that this dam's colostrum go to her calf? No, I don't think so. We don't have any evidence to support that. I think it can be any cow to any calf, but still stick with the one cow to one calf rule if it's fresh or raw. Now, storage time. If it is fresh or raw colostrum, assuming you collected it cleanly, you chilled it quickly, get it into the fridge, I still want to use it up within 1 to 2 days, because even in a functioning refrigerator, which is not a foregone conclusion on some farms, the bacteria is still going to slowly multiply in that refrigerated colostrum. So I still want to use it within a day or two. And if you're not going to do that, then get it in the freezer. There, we think it's good for at least 6 months, should be good for at least 6 months, assuming it doesn't go through multiple freeze thaw cycles. Now, if it's heat treated and really clean, and then it goes into one of those, a clean receptacle, the perfect udder bag or something else similar, then if it goes into a functioning refrigerator, I've got data that says it's good for at least 7 days, if not, a little bit longer, 7, 8, 9 days. So think of that like the shelf life on store-bought milk. If you heat treat it, the bacteria counts are really, really low. You put it somewhere clean, you keep it cold, you should have a really decent shelf life on that. To do that on a farm, you need to be comfortable that yes, we are heat treating it. Yes, it is going into a clean container, into a functioning fridge. Therefore, we should be okay with a little bit longer shelf life. But if in doubt, try to use it up within 2-3 days, something like that, or freeze it.
Isn't there a saying like, if in doubt, toss it out or something with food safety? I don't think I follow that with food safety, quite frankly, but
Yeah, Bob Shell is a veterinarian here in Minnesota. He's a great resource. He's done a lot of troubleshooting of colostrum systems over recent years, working with pasteurization systems and pasteurized milk systems. Anyway, yeah, his one of the little horror stories he shared with me was scenarios where the colostrum goes in the bag, gets frozen, but then in the freezer, it goes through multiple freeze thaw cycles because people keep putting warm bags in every day adjacent to the frozen bag. Thaws multiple times. Eventually, it's going to start growing bugs. And his words of advice were, if you open up the bag and stinky gas comes off the bag, to your point, throw it out.
Yeah,
not
good
good.
idea. So, Fred, do you have any last questions?
Well, we've covered a lot of interesting topics, had some great fun discussion. Sandra, give us a parting salvo here. What do you want producers to take away from today's program?
Well, I guess it's just a reminder that colostrum is, as bored as we might be talking about it for decades now, it is still that really important cornerstone of our young stock program. And I guess the one thing I would ask is if you and your veterinarian are not doing any monitoring of your program, and I would start by asking the calves, go bleed some calves and see how they're doing. If you're not monitoring, start with that. Make sure that things are going well. If they are, great. Move on to a bigger, more important bottleneck. If you bleed some calves and serum total proteins are low, then invite your vet to come in, work with you to do a thorough investigation of the whole program, because there may be some, important opportunities you're missing out on related to quality, quantity, quickness, cleanliness, inventory management for fall, things like that. There could be some really important opportunities for you. So start by monitoring and then just see where that takes you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Godden. We appreciate the opportunity to pick your brain and discuss one of the most important things we have in the calf barn, and that's colostrum. I'm here with the I-29 podcast with my partner, Jim Salfer. My name is Fred Hall, and we thank everyone for listening to the I-29 MooU podcast, and we look forward to having you back with us in a couple of weeks.
I-29 MOO University is an equal opportunity educator. For the full discrimination statement, visit extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.